Rob and Sophie got into a fight that may end their entire relationship. And in this video, we're gonna go over what happened, how they're both at fault, but kinda more Rob's fault, and most importantly, how they could have avoided it. Rob and Sophie go to meet Rob's sister Veronica at an arcade to get to know each other a little bit better, and things seem to be going pretty well, until the sister Veronica asks them if they've ever talked about having kids. And while Rob believes they've touched base on it,
like in general,
and thinks that yeah, one day eventually we'll have kids, Sophie tells us that they actually never really talked about it, and that she kinda might not want to ever have kids. Which comes as a total surprise to Rob, who then stands up and storms out of the conversation in frustration. Rob feels pretty shook about the whole thing, like he just got blindsided, so he goes to miss a few basketball shots to cool off. In the meantime, Sophie stays with his sister and talks about things for a little bit before going over to try to talk to Rob, who isn't having any of it. Rob's pretty mad about the whole thing and turns his anger and frustration in the situation to Sophie and starts blaming her like this whole miscommunication is all her fault. Rob's mad and just blames Sophie. Sophie feels like Rob's being super uncooperative and unhelpful about the whole thing. They have a terribly awkward drive home in silence, and once they get home, Sophie's too overwhelmed to talk about this, and Rob laments that he's not going to be able to sleep tonight and can't even imagine walking down the aisle with her anymore. Now, there's a lot to that story that I left out that we're going to talk about next, but I recapped it like that because what I just described were all the scenes where the two of them were together and were working with the same information. What I did not include, which we're about to talk about, were all the one-on-one scenes where we were able to learn something from Sophie's perspective, either through the cameras or talking to the sister, and Rob's perspective, where he's sharing it with the camera. So now let's look into all the details that really flesh out each other's side of the story to better understand how this all went so wrong. What's interesting about this right off the bat is yes, there's the obvious miscommunication about them not being on the same page on whether or not they want to have kids. But what I find even more interesting is the underlying miscommunication they had, where Rob believes they already talked about this, while Sophie doesn't think they talked about this at all. Regardless of whether he's right or not, and I think he's not right, which we'll talk about later, it seems like, at least in his head, Rob and his partner Sophie have agreed on this shared vision of their future together. So then when Sophie says that she actually might not want to have kids, at least from his perspective, it could feel like she is suddenly betraying and destroying this idea that he thought they worked on building together. After Rob stormed off, Sophie stuck around and talked to Veronica a little bit about why she didn't want to ever get pregnant. She explains that she's had some pretty serious medical conditions that to this day may affect her fertility. And a lot of the reason that she has hangups around being pregnant is because she's not sure if she can actually get pregnant.
Would I rather, be like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna be a mom one day, and then be told, actually, you can't have kids, because that's devastating. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and also explains why she said she doesn't think she ever wants to get pregnant, and not that she never wants to have kids. Seems like a pretty important thing for Rob to know to better understand her situation. But when Rob's sister asks, that makes sense, did you actually tell him this thing about your fertility? Sophie says, no. That's Sophie's first mistake. She already had an opinion on the kid debate, whether that's for medical reasons or whatever reason, but did not communicate that clearly to her partner Rob. So while she made the assumption that Rob would understand her perspective without really telling him any of her perspective, she also made some assumptions about Rob's perspective. She said, I did tell him about the surgery, I didn't mention the fertility thing, but if I told someone who really wanted kids that I had some ovarian problems, then clearly they should have asked, how did this affect your fertility? But Rob didn't ask that, and because Rob didn't ask that obvious question, then he must not want to have kids, right? I mean, no. That's a logical assumption, but it's an assumption nonetheless. I mean, what if Rob's just not that smart and didn't think that ovarian problems would affect fertility? She also defends her assumptions by saying, we've talked about our future together. We've talked about it for 3 years, how we'll eventually, get married and live in the woods with animals and all that. And not once in these 3 years of fantasizing did he ever include or mention a kid.
Not once has he ever mentioned kids. Not one time in this whole 3 years.
So naturally, since we're talking about the future and he didn't mention kids, so I assumed he didn't want to have kids. And while that is still an assumption, it is a pretty good assumption, to be fair. If you didn't talk about the future at all and you didn't mention kids, then, how would you know that they're not associating kids with the future? But if you guys have already talked about the future and gone into details and they didn't mention something as big as kids, I'd probably assume the same thing. It's still an assumption. That's the problem. Even if you think it's obvious, okay, it seems like they don't want kids, then you should ask, okay, so it sounds like you're not including kids in your future, so you don't want kids? There's no reason for something so big for you to just go on an assumption like that. You should still seek clarification. But Rob isn't just accusing Sophie of not being a clear communicator, he thinks this is all her fault. Remember, Sophie thinks that they've never actually had the conversation about kids, but Rob thinks that they have had the conversation and now Sophie is just changing things on him. So, from what we've seen on screen, does Rob have a point? No, not really. In fact, Rob didn't actually say, yeah, we talked about it. He said, we've touched base about it, which is kinda code for we haven't talked about it, but she should just know everything that I think already. Rob is adamant that Sophie knows what I want. She knows what I want and is now just being mean. That's a bold claim to say that Sophie knows what you want. And he justifies it by saying,
She knows what I want. She's known that I want kids. I told her, how does a man talk about what his kids' names would be? And then she gonna act like she doesn't remember that and act like she didn't know I would want kids. It just sounds stupid.
And credit where it's due, I can see where he's coming from there, but if that's her golden goose, like this is now, it's completely unequivocally her fault, I was totally clear because I said I like Bruce as a boy's name, then no, you're wrong. That's really not that clear. You don't think it's possible at all that anyone would say like, I really like the name Roger. I don't want kids, but if I ever did have kids, Roger would be a good name. No one would ever say that in your universe.
I don't know what Sophie saw us doing with our later years. Like, all right, we want to grind, we want to goal chase right now, and then what? Even Jay-Z and Beyonce got kids. If I wanted to not have kids, I'd probably be a player forever.
I don't know what she thought we would do later in our life if we didn't have kids. I mean, what's there to do in life except have kids? I mean, why else would I be in a committed relationship if I didn't want kids? It just doesn't make sense. Yeah, again, that's not direct at all. What else would you do if you didn't have kids? I don't know. Everything else there is to do in life? Like subscribing to my channel and liking the video? His sister even asks him later, so did you really talk about it before? And he says, well, it's definitely been put out there, but she just didn't hear it.
I feel like if I'm telling you what I would name my kids, obviously I want kids.
Well, if I told you what I would have named my kids, then you should know. No, you shouldn't. That's the second time he's brought up the kids' names thing, which says to me that he really thinks that this is his ace in a hole. Maybe he doesn't have 100 different memories of him telling her, but it could be that he really thinks this is such undeniable evidence that, well, because I said that, there was no reason or excuse of why she shouldn't know that I wanted kids this whole time. And that's ridiculous. That's just, if that's the best you got, I mean, that's really not even that good of a piece of evidence for an assumption to begin with. So, to summarize, in a healthy, functioning relationship, both partners should know what both partners feel about this topic. Rob and Sophie know what Rob wants, and Rob and Sophie know what Sophie wants. But in their situation, no one knows what Sophie wants, and they both disagree about what Rob wants. It's one thing to have a conversation about kids and have to work out those differences. That's not always the easiest conversation, but it is kind of a must to have. But what's not a must to have is the fight we see in this episode. Rob feeling blindsided and questioning if Sophie even listens or cares, Sophie worrying about their relationship now and if Rob hates her or seeing how uncooperative he's being. They needed to talk about kids, but none of that stuff needed to happen. So, how could they have avoided it? As I hope is clear by now, the problem is not the kids thing. The problem is that they miscommunicated about their own communication. The mistake they're both making is assuming that their partner can just read their mind and just know everything about them, and assuming then that when they miscommunicate, that's because they just must not care or must not love me or know anything about me. Well, they should know what I wanted. No, throw it out. I shouldn't have to tell them I'm upset. They should just know that I'm upset and know why. Nope, they shouldn't. They might have an idea and they could ask you about it, but it's your job to communicate directly. Rob can't rely on, well, why else would I have told her my kids' names? And Sophie can't rely on, well, if he did want kids, then he would have asked me about my fertility, or he would have mentioned this thing about our future. You see, all those explanations rely on deduction and reasoning, and frankly, you just shouldn't ever rely on giving someone mental homework to figure out and interpret what you're really meaning. They're making logical arguments like, if X, then Y. If not A, then what else? That all requires too much math, and frankly, no one wants to do math. So instead, take out the guesswork. No math, no deductions, no inferences. Here's an example with Rob and Sophie. Hey, I saw you stormed off. I'm really sorry about what's going on. How do you feel? I feel hurt and betrayed. I felt like we agreed on this thing this whole time and you've never told me no to having kids. But now after all this time and investments and letting me believe that we're going to have kids together, now you tell me you don't want kids. I feel like you knew this whole time and now you're just changing it when it's convenient. Oh, well, I understand how you would be really hurt then. I didn't know that you wanted kids this whole time, but I could understand that if you thought this whole time that we were on the same page about this whole thing, and after all this time you suddenly feel like I'm changing my mind on you, then yeah, I mean, that would feel terrible. I understand how you would feel like that. I actually thought you didn't want kids because, I told you about that medical stuff I had and, you never really wondered or seemed concerned about whether or not that would affect our pregnancy. And every time we talked about our future, with the woods and the animals, you never mentioned kids. So I actually thought you didn't want kids this whole time. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just explaining that that's what I heard. So this whole time I thought we were on a different page. Okay, well, I'm still mad, but I could understand that with that context, how it could seem like maybe I didn't want kids. I thought I was being totally clear. I told you like what I would name my kids, but okay, I guess I could see with those examples how you might think that I didn't want kids. Yeah, I actually remember you telling me what you would name our kids, but I just thought we were just being goofy at 3 a.m. just saying like what kind of names we would like on kids. I didn't know that actually meant you actually did want kids. I thought we were just talking hypothetically about what kind of names you like. I guess I just made an assumption and I really should have sought clarification from you when you said these things. I'm sorry for assuming and not asking. Yeah, well, I'm still hurt, but I can understand it's probably just a miscommunication. I guess I should have been more clear too, so I'm sorry. All in all, I think they're both pretty equally at fault for getting themselves into the situation to begin with. It really does take two people to communicate about this sort of thing. Even if one person is saying something, the other person has to make sure they're hearing it right. And regardless of whether or not they agreed about what Rob wants, was anyone gonna ask what Sophie wants? Rob should care and should be interested in what Sophie wants and not just assume that because she's quiet about it, then she's either wants it or even gauging how enthusiastic she is. Maybe he thinks that, all right, she's gonna go along with it, but you should still want to know if she's really excited about it or just kind of like, yeah, sure, if you want. And I'm not sure why Sophie never brought up what she wanted, but she's gonna learn to have to do that too. Kids are a big thing that affects both of their lives. So at the end of the day, it's both of their responsibilities to make sure that they're both on the same page about it. Regardless, at least after their altercation, it did seem like Sophie was the more open and receptive one, who was more interested in trying to figure things out and bridge the gap, while Rob was the more angry, blaming, unhelpful one. But it's hard to judge someone when they just discovered that their whole future might be called into question, so I don't want to be too harsh on Rob. That's it for today's video. Let me know what you thought about this couple in the comments down below. And if you like this video and you enjoy my content, then make sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button, ring the bell for notifications, and every comment helps the algorithm. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.